ma'am. Come on up here, please. Good afternoon. Before you have a seat on the witness stand, could you please turn to this meeting and raise your right hand? For the testimony you're about to give will be the truth. Please have a seat. The following questions for Mr. Lewis and glasses, and perhaps also Mr. Gill. Just nod at. Go ahead, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Francis.
Hi.
Could you please state your name and spell it for the court reporter?
Yes, my name is Heather Francis, Heather Francis.
Ms. Francis, how are you currently employed?
I'm employed as a firearm and tool mark examiner at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences, that's also known as SWIFS, or the Dallas County Crime Lab.
How long have you been with SWIFS?
I've been with SWIFS since January of 2002, so a little more than 16 and a half years.
How long have you been in the field of firearm and tool mark examination?
I've been with SWIFS for 16 and a half years. Prior to being employed here, I was a forensic technologist in the firearms section at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in Tallahassee, Florida, for about 2 years.
And what does a firearms and tool mark examiner do?
Primarily, we are responsible for examining firearms when they come in to ensure that they're functional and to ensure that there are no anomalies that would make it unsafe to fire, and to test fire those items, those firearms, and compare them to fired ammunition components, which are fired cartridge cases or fired bullets.
And how many of these examinations have you performed in the course of your career?
Conservatively, hundreds.
Okay. And have you testified in court as an expert witness in this field?
I have.
On few or many occasions?
Many, a little over 100.
And that includes within Dallas County?
Yes.
All right, so please explain to the members of the jury how an examination of this kind actually works.
Well, with tool mark examination, it's a discipline in forensic science that deals with the comparative study of tool marks and tools that leave those tool marks. Comparisons are performed using a comparison microscope, and the tool marks that we're looking for are called individual characteristics, and those individual characteristics are random irregularities that are imparted to a tool or a firearm, which is considered a tool, during the manufacture process of that firearm, through use and abuse of that firearm. Those unique characteristics, those tool marks, whenever the tool comes into contact with a softer object or a workpiece such as a cartridge case or a bullet, those random irregularities can be imparted to those cartridge cases or bullets. And what we're looking for are the uniqueness and the randomness of those tool marks to distinguish those marks as being made by a particular tool as opposed to being made by a different tool.
Okay, you mentioned individual characteristics. What are class characteristics?
Class characteristics are a more general, non-microscopic type of characteristic. They can narrow down what we as firearms examiners are looking for. For example, a class characteristic can be a caliber of a firearm, the caliber of a bullet. It can be the number of lands and grooves within the barrel. The number of lands and grooves within the barrel are called the rifling, and that rifling is given a certain dimension and a certain number by the manufacturer of that firearm. It can be 6 lands and grooves with a right twist, and the widths of those lands and grooves are determined by the manufacturer. Those are examples of class characteristics. Where the individual characteristics are found are within those class characteristics. So they're a more constrictive group of characteristics that we're looking for.
Can you describe for the members of the jury how a firearm actually works?
Depending on the type of firearm, for example, a semi-automatic firearm is typically a firearm that has one chamber, and the chamber is part of the barrel. The source of ammunition for a semi-automatic firearm is going to be a magazine. So the ammunition or the cartridges are loaded into the magazine. The magazine would be inserted into the grip or into the magazine well, which is located within the grip of the firearm. Whenever the slide is pulled back on the firearm, the topmost cartridge in that magazine is going to pop up and be in the way of the slide. When the slide comes forward, that slide will chamber the unfired cartridge. While the slide was back and rearward, if there is a hammer or if there is a striker, those items were made ready to fire. They were cocked. So when the slide comes forward, then the firearm is ready to fire. One pull of the trigger will fire one cartridge. After that cartridge is fired, the slide will move in a rearward direction. It will pull out or extract the cartridge case from the chamber, and if there is an ejector, the ejector is on the opposite side of the extractor, and that moving cartridge case will suddenly stop on the ejector and flip out of the firearm. Meanwhile, the slide has cocked the hammer again. The topmost cartridge in the magazine, if there is another cartridge in the magazine, has moved up into position and is ready to be pushed into the chamber by that slide, and the whole operation is ready to fire again. Another pull of the trigger will cause all of that stuff to happen again. That's semi-automatic. If it was a full automatic firearm, one pull of the trigger and keeping the trigger pulled to the rear would have cycled that firearm to fire a cartridge until the magazine or the source of ammunition was empty. For a revolver, that's a different type of handgun in which there is a revolving cylinder that has many chambers. The chambers of that firearm have to be manually, the cartridges in the chambers of that firearm have to be manually removed. So if they were not manually removed, they would stay with that firearm. But pulling the trigger with the hammer in the down position, pulling the trigger will be a double action type of mechanism where pulling the trigger will rotate the cylinder and put the cartridge in the way of the hammer and put the cartridge in the barrel and ready to fire in the barrel. If the hammer was pulled back manually, then pulling the hammer back manually would rotate that cylinder, and then pulling the trigger would be a single action and fire the cartridge.
Okay. So based upon these firearms and tool mark examinations that you described for the jury, are you able to determine whether or not a bullet or a bullet component was fired by a particular gun?
Yes.
Okay. And that's by these individual characteristics that you described for the members of the jury?
Yes.
Okay, so going specifically to this particular analysis that you did in this case, lab number IFS-17-07795, you actually performed a couple of examinations in this case, is that right?
I did.
So looking specifically at request 0009, what was that analysis?
May I refer to my notes?
Yeah.
Thank you. Request 0009 of IFS 17-07795. What was your question again? I'm
yes.
sorry.
What kind of analysis did you perform under that particular request number?
I received a semi-automatic rifle, a magazine. I received unfired cartridges, and I received fired cartridge cases of various calibers. I was to determine if the firearm was functional and to compare all the fired evidence that I received. I also received or examined a bullet jacket from autopsy, as well as bullet jacket fragments and lead fragments.
Okay, can you please describe for the jury the evidence, all the evidence that was submitted? I know that you said that you received several fired cartridge casings of different calibers, is that correct?
Cartridge cases, yes.
Yes, could you please describe what they were for the members of the jury?
Sure. I received 4 Federal brand .223 Remington caliber fired cartridge cases. I received 4 Federal brand .40 S&W caliber fired cartridge cases. I received 7 Remington brand 9mm Luger caliber cartridge cases, and I received 1 Privy Partisan brand 9mm Luger caliber fired cartridge case.
The weapon that was submitted to you was a Modern Outfitters 223 Remington caliber semi-automatic rifle, model MC5 modern carbine, is that correct?
I did receive, yes, 1 Modern Outfitters 223 Remington caliber semi-automatic rifle, yes.
And based upon your examination of the firearm, was it functional?
It was.
Okay. Any defects to it from your examination?
No.
All right. And was that particular firearm a deadly weapon?
I believe firearms are considered deadly weapons, yes.
I'm going to show you a variety of exhibits here. Francis, if you could take a look at those and tell me whether or not you recognize those. For the record, you're looking at State Exhibit number 282. And what is State Exhibit number 282?
Just a moment. State's Exhibit 282 includes my item number 12-1-1, which is a magazine, and lab item 12-1-2, which are 6 Federal brand .223 Remington caliber unfired cartridges.
Next, we're going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibits 230, 231, 232, and 233. And before we go forward, let me ask you about State's Exhibit 232. Does it have some kind of indication with regard to what you may have personally put on this exhibit so that the members of the jury know that this is the evidence that you examined in this case?
Yes, State's Exhibit 282 includes those unfired cartridges in the magazine, and the information that I'm looking for are the laboratory case number, my item number, my initials, and the date that I marked these items. And all of these items are marked with those identifying characteristics.
So state exhibits number 230, 231, 232, and 233. If you can examine those and tell the members of the jury what those are.
States Exhibit 230 is laboratory item number 8-1-1. States Exhibit 231 is laboratory item number 9-1-1. States Exhibit 232 is laboratory item number 10-1-1. States Exhibit 233 is laboratory item 11-1-1. All of these items have my identifying marks on there of the laboratory case number, that particular item number, my initials, and the date that those items were marked. They each include one fired .223 Remington caliber Federal brand cartridge case.
Okay. You can take a look at state exhibit number 234, 235, 236, 237, 238, 239, 240, 241, 242, 243, 244, and 245.
Okay. States Exhibit 234 is laboratory item number 16-1-1. Thank you. States Exhibit 235 is laboratory item number 19-1-1. States Exhibit 236 is item 18-1-1. Excuse me, States Exhibit 235 is item 17-1-1. States Exhibit 237 is item 19-1-1. States Exhibit 238 is item 20-1-1. States Exhibit 239 is laboratory item 21-1-1. States Exhibit 240 is item 22-1-1. States Exhibit 241 is lab item 23-1-1. States Exhibit 242 is lab item 24-1-1. States Exhibit 243 is item 25-1-1. States Exhibit 244 is laboratory item 26-1-1. And States Exhibit 245 is lab item 27-1-1.
And so each of those exhibits are either 40 caliber fire cartridge casing or 9mm, is that correct?
Yes, they are either 40 S&W caliber fired cartridge cases or 9mm Luger caliber fired cartridge cases.
We also show you what's been marked as States Exhibit number 285. You can please tell us what that is.
States Exhibit 285 contains the test-fired cartridge cases and bullets that I made. I produced using the submitted firearm. My seal appears to be unbroken, so I was the last person to close this up.
I wanted to cut over for the record what's been already admitted for record purposes as States Exhibit number 284A. We're going to show you what I'm going to now mark as States number 284. Tell me whether or not you recognize what that is.
Okay, States Exhibit 284 contains laboratory item numbers 6-4-1, 6-4-2, and 6-4-3, which are items from autopsy. They include 4 fired bullet jacket fragments and 8 lead fragments. Again, my seal appears to be the last one, and it is not broken, and I don't see where there's another opening, so those items should be contained in here.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked. States Exhibit number 229, for the record, this has been made safe by the bailiff.
Okay. Still. Thank you. This item is item 14-1, and again, it's marked with the laboratory case number, the laboratory item number, my initials, and the date that I marked it. This is a Modern Outfitters 223 Remington caliber semi-automatic rifle, the one that I examined in this case.
why don't you mark your spot? We're going to take a brief recess. All rise for the jurors.
We're ahead and opened up State's Exhibits 285. I wonder if you could tell the members of the jury what that is.
State's Exhibit 285 contains the testifiers that I produced using the item 14-1 rifle. These items include fired cartridge cases and fired bullet jackets. Each are marked with the laboratory item number, the testifier sequence number, and their own item number along with my initials and the date that they were marked. The cartridge cases do. The bullets were marked prior to firing themselves. However, those marks are unable to be seen right now because of the condition that the fragments are in and where they were marked. However, one firearm is test fired at one time, so I know that these are the bullets or the bullet jackets that I used in this case for comparison purposes.
Okay, and likewise, State number 284, you can pull that out and describe for the jury what that is.
State's number Exhibit 284 contains items from autopsy. Because these items were so small in nature, they were repackaged by me in other smaller envelopes, and the envelopes were marked. The items themselves were not.
Judge,
Yes, sir. I'm listening.
we have a similar issue to what we had with Ms. Castro with regards to these items that came from autopsy.
All of them additionally relevant, assuming that you can prove them up later. So your objections are ruled.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Wood.
One of the items, the item 6-4-1, is contained in the this envelope. It's marked with the laboratory item number, that laboratory case number, my initials, and the date, and sealed by me. One of the other smaller packages contains items 6-4-2, which are 4 fired bullet jacket fragments. The envelope has that item number, the laboratory case number, my initials, and the date, and my seal. Another of the packages contains items 6-4-3, which are 8 lead fragments. The container has my initials, the date, that item number, and that laboratory case number along with my seal. The other item or container has is a piece of jacketing that came off of item 6-4-1. When I was bending the jacket, it came off and is packaged in a separate, smaller container with my item number, or the laboratory item number, the laboratory case number, my initials, and the date, and along with my seal.
Sorry.
You apologize.
So at this time, I'm going to the State will offer State Exhibit number 285 for all purposes. Test fires.
No further objection.
Objections voted. Objections overruled. Do you have any objection?
So at this time, the State will offer State's Exhibit number 284.
And to that we object. object because the beginning of the chain of custody on those items has not been shown.
Objection's over. Do your own objection.
And just for the rules.
Earlier you conditionally admitted them. Are you now admitting them for all purposes? Or
280, my understanding of 284, yes, sir.
They came from autopsy.
And then they're conditionally admitted, subject to the medical exam. Thank you, Mr. Gill.
So Ms. Francis states 284, again, the bullet fragments from the autopsy. This was came from the medical examiner during the autopsy, is that correct?
Yes, it would have.
Particularly the medical examiner will take photographs of this evidence as well prior to submitting it to the firearms unit.
I don't know when they take their photographs. I know when I take my photographs.
Okay, but they would typically take any photographs of any evidence they collect during autopsy?
I have seen photographs. I'm not sure what their procedure is.
Okay. All right, so let's get to the conclusions of your examination. And let's start with the rifle, 223 rifle. Were you able to compare the rifle to the 4 223 casings that were submitted?
I was. I test fired. I determined that the firearm was functional, and I test fired it into a water tank so that I could collect the fired projectiles or the fired bullet fragments, as they turned out to be, along with the fired cartridge cases. And I compared all the test fires to each other to determine that the marks were, the tool marks that I needed to see were repeating. And then I compared the 4 fired 223 Remington caliber fired cartridge cases to the test fired cartridge cases, and I compared the item 6-4-1 fired bullet jacket from autopsy to the fired bullet jacket, test fired bullet jackets that I have.
Okay. And were you also able to compare the 223 rifle to your items 006-004-001, the fired bullet jacket from the autopsy?
Yes, and just for purposes of shortening the item numbers, all of the zeros that are on the request 0009 are placeholders, so when I refer to them as 6-4-1, it's the same as the 006-004-001, the same with all of those other item numbers that I described.
Okay, and with regard to the examination, were you able to state whether or not the fired bullet jacket was matched to the 223 rifle?
I determined that item 6-4-1 fired bullet jacket from autopsy was fired by the submitted firearm.
I'm not sure if I followed up on my last question with regards to the rifle and the fired casings, the 4 casings, the 223. Were you able to match those to the rifle as well? I'm sorry.
I did. I determined that the 4 fired 223 Remington caliber fired cartridge cases were also fired by the submitted rifle.
Okay. And specifically with regard to the 4 40 caliber fired cartridge casings, were you able to make any conclusions as pertains to those?
I determined that all 4 of those 40 S&W caliber fired cartridge cases were fired by the same unknown firearm.
Okay. And what do you mean by unknown?
Unknown means that I did not receive a firearm to make test fires with to compare to a particular firearm.
Were you able to conclude that the 4 40 caliber casings were not fired from the 223 rifle?
Those, based on differences in class characteristics or differences in caliber of those 2 items, the 40 caliber or the 40 S&W caliber cartridge cases were not fired by the rifle, by the submitted rifle.
Okay, moving on to the 8 9mm fired cartridge casings, what were your conclusions on those?
I determined that all 8 of the 9mm Luger caliber fired cartridge cases were fired by the same unknown firearm.
Again, no firearm was submitted, so you can compare those to any firearm.
Correct.
Were you able to determine that the 9mm casings were also not fired from the 223 rifle?
Correct. Again, with the differences of caliber, a class characteristic, the 9mm Luger caliber fired cartridge cases were not fired by the 223 caliber rifle. Additionally, the 9mm Luger caliber cartridge cases were not fired by the 40 caliber firearm that fired the .40 S&W caliber fired cartridge cases either.
Okay, to your item 6-4-2, the 4 fired bullet jackets from the autopsy, bullet jacket fragments. What were your conclusions as it pertains to those, and you matching those to any weapon?
For its item 6-4-2, which are 4 fired bullet jacket fragments from autopsy, I determined that those were unsuitable for comparison purposes. So they weren't compared to anything. They weren't able to be compared to anything.
When you say that they're unsuitable, what does that mean?
I mean, specifically for items 6-4-2, they did not have any comparable relevant tool marks, meaning they did not have any comparable rifling characteristics.
Okay, and 6-4-3, the 8 lead fragments from the autopsy, how about those?
Those 8 lead fragments did not have any tool marks on them at all, so they were also unsuitable for comparison purposes.
There were also 2 metal fragments that were submitted, your item number 15-1-1. Were you able to examine those as well?
Those 2 items were also unsuitable for comparisons, and they were just determined to be metal fragments. They didn't have any indications that they were even parts of a bullet.
So you also conducted another analysis under the case under request 0010, is that right?
Yes.
What kind of analysis was that?
That is called a range of fire analysis, and in this case I examined hair from the autopsy to determine if there was any gunpowder present in the hair.
Can you please describe for the members of the jury how you conduct that analysis?
Sure.
Judge, we have a similar objection here because this item also came presumably from autopsy, and the chain of custody is not shown.
Conditionally admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Francis, you were describing how you conduct the hair analysis.
Sure. Using the aid of a stereo microscope, I examine the hair microscopically for any gunpowder that might be present. Gunpowder is the ammunition, it's in the center or the case of the ammunition that causes the firearm or the bullet to come out of the barrel, or the cycling of the firearm once that gunpowder starts to burn. Sometimes the gunpowder doesn't fully burn, and depending on distance, there may be gunpowder present on an item that has a bullet defect. And in this case, I examined the hair and for the presence of gunpowder, and I did not observe any.
You mentioned distance. What kind of distances are we talking where you may detect some kind of gunpowder on these types of items?
Typically, a range of fire analysis is to determine the distance from the muzzle of the firearm or the end of the firearm to the item that has a bullet defect. The majority of the range of fire analysis that we do in the laboratory have to do with clothing and not hair. But with the clothing, when you subject it to chemical processes, you can establish a pattern of gunshot residues that may or may not be visible microscopically or visually. And then if you have a firearm and the same ammunition, you can make test panels at various distances and treat those panels with the same chemical processes that you did with the clothing or the other item, the question item, and compare those patterns to each other and determine a range, not an exact distance, because in the laboratory we can't replicate exactly what happened. So we determine a range of a low end being my pattern of my test target is a lot closer than what I see represented on the question clothing, up to a broad range where my test pattern that I see is almost non-existent and doesn't replicate what I see on my test target. So we give a low end of what we know it's not to a high end of what we know it's not.
Can you give the members of the jury some idea of those, a number on those distances that you're talking about?
For clothing purposes, typically we have a range that we produce. We do contact up to 72 inches, and from contact to 3 inches, 6 inches, 12 inches, and then beyond 12 inches we go every 12 inches, usually out to 72 inches, which is 6 feet, which is where a majority of the time the patterns of gunshot residues are almost non-existent.
Say you have an object between the firearm and wherever the bullet actually ends up going. Would that have an effect whether or not you may see gunshot residue or gunpowder? Specifically, say if someone who was struck by a bullet from a firearm inside a car and there's a window in between that, would that have some kind of effect on whether or not you're going to see that evidence?
Yes, if there is what we call an interposed target, if there is something between the item that is struck and the muzzle of the firearm, then that interposed target is going to be the one that would collect the gunshot residues instead of where the bullet may actually end up.
And specifically with regard to the rifle, the 223 states 229, you had mentioned before with regard to semi-automatic weapons, this is a semi-automatic, is that correct?
Yes, the item 14-1 rifle is a semi-automatic rifle.
Say that there's evidence that there was 5 shots fired from this particular weapon. Based upon your prior testimony, would that mean the trigger had to be pulled 5 separate different times?
Yes.
Okay. And you also conducted a trigger pull analysis on this weapon, is that correct?
As part of the mechanical evaluation and function test, yes, I did perform a trigger pull analysis or evaluation.
Can you explain to the jury what that is and what the results of that were?
A trigger pull analysis is simply not a calculation, but a test of the trigger to see how many pounds of force it takes to pull the trigger to cause sear release or to cause the firearm to fire.
Okay. And what were the results of this particular examination on this firearm?
They're located in my notes.
Okay. Can you tell the jury what that is from your notes?
Oh, yes, sorry. Two trigger pull tests were performed, and they were determined to be, the first trigger pull was determined to be 5.474 pounds of force to pull, and the second one was determined to be 5.498 pounds of force to pull the trigger to cause the firearm to fire.
Ms. Francis, is your testimony to this jury today based upon your own personal examination of all the evidence that was submitted to you?
It is.
Did you have any conversations with anyone from the Ball Springs Police Department on this case?
No.
Did you complete reports in this case on your firearms analysis as well as your range of fire analysis?
I did.
I'm going to show you what's been marked in States Exhibits 248 and 264, if you can tell the members of the jury what those items are.
States Exhibit 248 is a copy of my test report on firearms analysis. The request number is 0009. And it's a copy with the exception of the State's Exhibit sticker. State's Exhibit 264 is a copy of my test report on range of fire analysis. It's request number 0010, and it's a copy with the exception of the State's Exhibit sticker.
And you made both of these reports, is that correct?
I did.
Is that the ordinary course of business for SWIFTs to make these reports in the furtherance of your duties?
Yes.
Are you the custodian of these records?
Yes,
Are they fair and accurate copies of your original?
they are.
Have they been altered in any way?
Just with State's Exhibit stickers.
Okay. And are you required to report accurately the results of your findings in these particular examinations?
Yes.
State law for State Exhibits 248 and 264, Your Honor, continue to counsel.
We object, they're hearsay, and they're cumulative of her testimony.
The objections to 248 and 264 overruled. To the running objection, they are removed for all purposes. You may comment.
Thank you, Your Honor.
As well as to the extent that the tests were performed on items that are conditionally relevant, they are removed as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, I'll pass the witness.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. In both of those reports that you just testified to, and all of the analysis you've been discussing here today, were done in Institute of Forensic Sciences, IFS-17-07-07795. Is that correct?
That is the laboratory case number, yes.
That is your laboratory case number, and that is it's a laboratory case number that Ms. Castro operated under also, isn't it?
It is.
And you performed analysis in request number 0009 and 10,
Correct.
correct? And you did not prepare a report that had to do with the trigger pull analysis that you just talked about, did you?
An additional report, no. And trigger pull analysis is not something that is reported procedurally.
And why is that?
Because we consider it a descriptor of the mechanical evaluation and not something that is to be reported unless it's specifically requested at the time of analysis.
And it wasn't, was it?
Not at the time, no.
And what is the relevance of the trigger pull analysis to the functioning of the firearm?
Just another descriptor of how the firearm was functioning at the time.
Was there anything unusual about the trigger pull weight on this firearm?
Not to me, there was not.
You were able to fire it perfectly well to make your test fires, weren't you?
Yes.
And to do the trigger pull analysis, the trigger pull weight analysis, that's done mechanically, isn't it?
In our laboratory, yes, it is.
And how is that done?
We have a mechanism called trigger scan, and it's a piece of hardware that we set up in the trigger guard and the trigger of the firearm. The firearm is set up on a vise, and this arm and its anvil are put in the inside of the trigger guard. You hit enter, and the arm or the sensor mechanically moves and pushes the trigger and determines what the trigger pull is based on when the sear is released. And then it comes back, and then you have to manually cock the firearm and get it ready to fire again, and then you can perform another trigger pull analysis. And that software prints up everything on a chart, and that's our trigger pull analysis.
And I think I asked you this already, that's done mechanically, is that right?
Yes.
And it's done dry firing the weapon also.
Correct.
And what does that mean for anybody that doesn't know what that might mean?
Dry firing means there are there's no ammunition in the chamber, there's no ammunition in the magazine. It's not going to fire anything. There's nothing in the chamber.
And does the trigger scan system also measure take-up, what we might call take-up?
Yes.
And what is that, and how is it measured?
Take-up is another sensory aspect of the trigger pull that's determined by the arm of the trigger pull of the trigger scan machine, and it has to do with how far that sensor has to travel before it touches the trigger.
If I use the word creep, what does creep mean with regard to trigger pull analysis?
I don't know.
You don't know that the trigger scan system also measures creep?
I don't see it on my printout.
And what you've been measuring is pull force, is that correct?
Correct.
Does the system also measure over travel and lock time?
It does. Well, it measures over travel. I don't see anything there for lock time.
But the bottom line on all this is that there was a firearm that was functioning perfectly fine. Is that right?
Yes, there was nothing to indicate to me that it was malfunctioning or that it had been altered or anything like that.
Did the firearm, as it was presented to you, also contain a couple of add-on features?
Let me check.
It's right next to you also if you want to have a visual look at it.
Okay. There was a scope attached, there was a sling attached, and there was a light that was also attached.
So rather than, is the word scope an appropriate word, or is it rather an optic sight?
I call it a scope.
Well, is it used for distance shooting, or is it used as an optical device to figure out where that rifle's pointing?
I don't know what the scope in this case was used for.
Did you not use the scope to perform your test firing?
I did not.
How did you perform your test firing?
We have a water tank. There is a tube at the end of the water tank, and the muzzle is put into the tube, so there's no aiming involved, and I pulled the trigger.
Okay, so you didn't even have to aim it.
I did not.
And how many times did you test fire it?
3.
And the purpose of test firing into water such as that is that you have a medium to slow down the bullet and capture it without damaging it.
Without damaging it to the point that it's not identifiable.
Because ultimately what you're going to do is take your test fire and put it under a comparison microscope alongside one of your question bullets to determine whether or not they came from the same firearm. Is that right?
Afterwards, yes. First, I would take my test fires and compare them to each other to make sure those marks are repeating, and then compare them to any question items that were suitable class characteristics or the suitable caliber for comparison purposes.
And you did that in this case?
Yes.
And you found that your test fires were suitable for comparison purposes?
Yes.
And you went on to compare those to the question 223 cartridges that were submitted to you, correct?
I compared them to the fired cartridge cases that were 223 Remington caliber, yes.
And you reached the conclusion that the 4 223 cartridge cases that were submitted to you by Detective Whaley were fired from State's Exhibit 229, the modern carbine rifle. Is that right?
I determined that the 4 223 Remington caliber fired cartridge cases that were submitted to the laboratory by the Dallas County Sheriff's Office were fired by the item 14-1 Modern Outfitters 223 Remington caliber semi-automatic rifle that I examined in this case.
Which is the rifle right next to you.
Correct.
So Detective Whaley testified earlier today that he knew that that firearm had fired those cartridge casings, and you've scientifically confirmed that, I guess. Is that right?
I have scientifically confirmed that those cartridge cases were fired by that firearm, yes.
Now, with regard to you were also submitted some 40 caliber cartridge cases. Is that right?
Correct.
And there were, I believe, 4 of those. Is that right?
Yes.
And you compared those to each other
Yes.
and to the tool marks that were left on those cartridge cases by the firing in the weapon they were fired in. Is that right?
Yes, I compared those cartridge cases to each other for tool marks from left by the firearm, yes.
And just generally, what type of tool marks were you comparing on those 4 cartridge cases?
For the 40 caliber cartridge cases, areas that were used to identify them or compare them to each other, identify them, is called the firing pin aperture shear.
Okay, and we all know what a firing pin is. That's what hits the primer of the cartridge and
Yes.
causes the firing of the cartridge. Is that right?
Correct.
And did you do that to compare each of the 4 cartridge cases to each other?
I looked at, I identified them on their firing pin aperture shear.
And you were able to identify those as having been fired from the same firearm to the exclusion of all other firearms in the world. Is that right?
That is not how we testify any longer, because we cannot examine all the firearms ever made in the entire world. What we can say is that it's my opinion that these were fired by the same gun. There haven't been any examples of firearms that have produced the same individual characteristics from one to the next, even when produced using the same tool. However, I cannot say to the exclusion of all other firearms.
Is a 40 caliber firearm a semi-automatic firearm?
The 40 S&W caliber firearm is a semi-automatic firearm.
Is a 40 caliber semi-automatic firearm a deadly weapon?
Yes.
Is there a national database that is used by law enforcement nationwide for the comparison of firearms and cartridge cases?
If you're referring to NIBIN, there is a database called NIBIN, which is the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, and it is for entering images of fired cartridge cases into this database to determine if perhaps the firearm that fired those cartridge cases, whether you have the firearm or not, may have been involved in other shootings.
You submitted data from these 40 caliber cartridge cases that you looked at in this case you had that done and submitted that information into NIBIN, is that right?
I took one of these cartridge cases, one of the 40 caliber cartridge cases, or 40 S&W caliber cartridge cases, was physically mailed or sent to the ATF lab in Walnut Creek, California. ATF is the, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. They have a NIBIN unit. We do not have a NIBIN unit. They enter cartridge case images into NIBIN for us, and they do correlations, or they look at other images of 40 S&W caliber cartridge cases that may have come up in the search that may look like what was submitted in this case.
And you also looked at 8 9mm cartridge cases, is that right?
Yes, I looked at 8 9mm Luger caliber fired cartridge cases as well.
Are 9mm Luger cartridge cases designed to be fired in a semi-automatic weapon?
The most common firearm is a semi-automatic firearm for 9mm Luger caliber cartridge cases.
Is a 9mm semi-automatic firearm a deadly weapon?
Yes.
Did you also cause data from these 9mm cases to be submitted to NIBIN?
Yes, I took one of those 9mm because they were all ID'd to each other. One of those was also mailed or sent to the ATF lab in Walnut Creek for the same NIBIN entry as the 40 S&W caliber cartridge case was.
We pass the witness.
Mr. Lewis,
No further questions.
will this witness be finally excused?
Yes, Your Honor, please take.
Please, ma'am, you may stand down. Please don't discuss your testimony with anybody else. And watch your testimony now.
Subject to recall.
Subject to recall. Thank you.
Me?
Yes, ma'am.